Okay, great. Thanks very much, Lisa and Richard and Natalie. I'll just share my screen. And I had prepared a talk that was for a little bit longer, so I'm going to cut out a few slides and just make it all right for the time. But if you can tell me if you can see.
Just wrong screen. It's just click displays, change display.
Okay, you've got that one. Okay.
Yep, perfect.
All right, terrific. Yeah, thanks very much, everybody. So I had changed my topic because the work on the other topic is still continuing. But what I wanted to talk about today was economic evaluation alongside clinical trials in a new age or a new epoch, and that is the age of Anthropocene, which is where I mean, it's still debated, but it's where human impact has made changes to the planet. And particularly, we see that in rising global temperatures and also probably in plastics pollution. So it will be official if people see plastic in sedimentary rock or in fossils, and that fossils are changed because of heat stress or adaptation of species to warming temperatures. So it's in that sort of context that I have been thinking about why there's a good argument for considering environmental impacts in the work that we do, particularly in cost effectiveness analyses. I'm going to talk a bit about methods on how to do this and when it might be useful to do. So we are probably well aware of some of the health impacts of climate change in terms of heat stress and transmission of infectious diseases. Possibly less aware of the responsibility or the contribution of the health sector to impacting climate change itself. So the health sector being a major polluter, and in Australia contributes somewhere between 5 and 7% of total carbon emissions from our country, carbon being the most significant greenhouse gas. And there are several policies and policy documents from the federal government, state governments, and also local health districts about different, climate mitigation or adaptation strategies or targets. In particular, there's government targets for net zero emissions by 2050, which would require a massive reduction in current greenhouse gas emissions. And the National Health and Climate Strategy really brought health alongside other sectors of government in terms of how what needs to be done to achieve this. The pie chart on the right really just shows you that the majority of carbon emissions come from activities in public hospitals and private hospitals, and also through medicines, pharmaceuticals. As of, I think, July this year, for procurement, it's a requirement for all Commonwealth organisations and those providing goods and services to Commonwealth organisations to report the carbon emissions of their operations. And so this is potentially also going to be applicable to providers of healthcare. Prioritising new goods and services with a low carbon footprint. So the process or the principle of decarbonisation. And this might be able to be achieved at a number of different levels. One is through assessment at the TGA, another is through health technology assessment, or through local procurement. And I know there's people online who've got experience in all of those three levels. And just to bring to your attention in terms of health technology assessment, the recent HTA review into medicines, recommendation 43. Recommendation 43 is about environmental impact reporting. So the main process is, or the main requirement is, to investigate the options in consultation with industry and stakeholders for reporting environmental impacts in the assessment of health technologies. And the timing is good for us to investigate options and look at, what could be done, how it might be done, because pharmaceutical companies are being required to report the carbon emissions of their products for other regulations. And two, PAS 2050 is a British international standard that is almost ready for dissemination, specifically about how you quantify carbon emissions from health products. And governments want to work together and adopt the highest standards for how this might be done. So that's likely to be ready in the next 18 months or so. So what does that have to do with clinical trials? I've been thinking about, Siri is just answering that question for me. I've just been thinking about how clinical trials being a platform for evaluation might also be a useful platform for evaluating environmental impacts from models of care or drugs or devices, in the same way that we might evaluate some of the other components you can see on the slide there. The other area when I first started in this topic a few years ago was to think, well, perhaps if we're going to incorporate environmental impacts, really all we're doing is an evaluation from a societal perspective, where we would include environmental impacts alongside other things like, productivity changes, caregiver impacts, impacts on other sectors like education or criminal justice. So that's certainly where we started out. And one of the papers here is it's a randomised trial. It was a pilot trial, and we did adopt a societal perspective. So this is the MEL-SELF trial. We did adopt a societal perspective where we looked at a range of different costs outside of the health sector, and we included costs to the environment. As I've been thinking more about this, I don't think that a societal perspective necessarily is required if you are wanting to include environmental impacts. And some of my thinking about that is that we could instead describe a health system and environmental perspective. And the reasons for that are that because of the very nature of the health technology and the fact that it is contributing to overall greenhouse gas emissions, and they in turn impact on health, there might be an argument that including an environmental, or planetary impact is an important thing to do in and of itself, regardless of whether there are also impacts from, other sectors. So and I'm happy to talk more about that another time. Are carbon emissions just externalities, or is warming climate, is that just an externality? And again, that was the position that I started off in, and thought, well, perhaps we just internalize this externality using standard measures. But as I've thought a little bit more about what an externality is, I don't think carbon emissions fits the definition. So an externality occurs when, something that is produced or you consume, the third party is not directly involved in the transaction. So you might have, positive externalities like herd immunity from vaccinations. So you may not have had that vaccination, but you benefit from the herd immunity from the population, or negative externality, a cost like pollution, and that an externality is usually not reflected in prices. Now, we all know that some countries have carbon taxes. We had a carbon tax for a couple of years during the Gillard government, and companies are, perhaps not fossil fuel companies, but others, are having to report on their carbon emissions and sometimes having to, pay penalties, or may even get a premium if they have a low carbon emitting product. So to say that it's not reflected in prices, I think is probably not correct. And the other thing is that the ability for, and this is what my environmental science colleagues tell me, the ability for the Earth to continue to absorb carbon through carbon sinks is also finite, is a scarce resource. And that it's likely that we'll have to adapt and mitigate if we're not able to actually reduce emissions. So in that way, this, externality, if you like, is likely to affect, if not us, then future generations. Anyway, a little bit of a philosophical argument. The other really big topic to sort of think about is, are environmental impacts, should they be considered on the cost side of the equation or on the benefits, the outcome side of the equation? And several years ago, there were methods developed within the Disability Adjusted Life Years framework for quantifying damage to human health as a result of carbon emissions. And you can see a reference to a report at the bottom of the slide. And that the valuation was between 2 and 4 DALYs per kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. However, in Australia, if we're thinking about health technology assessment or much of the academic economic evaluation that's done, we tend to use quality adjusted life years. And for some pragmatic reasons, kilograms of CO2 equivalent are used or often included in the cost side. And that seems to work. I mean, it would be perhaps my argument that that is an easier thing to do and probably the best way to do it, because we can quantify the emissions in natural units associated with healthcare use or healthcare activity. All right, 10 minutes. So the next couple of slides are methods for incorporating carbon emissions, and you may be familiar with this. So the first one is thinking about reporting carbon emissions alongside other components of an economic evaluation and not integrating it into a cost effectiveness ratio. So presenting existing the economic summary measures such as an ISA and the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions alongside in the same way that you might disaggregate other information, potentially, equity or other components of relevance that are not integrated into an ISA. Then there were 2 methods proposed by Kindred that have piqued a lot of interest, but I think they're a little bit problematic myself to decision making. And that is where you report 2 ratios, either for a cost ratio or an effectiveness ratio in addition to the ISA. So the first one is the incremental carbon footprint cost ratio, which is the difference in carbon emissions from the intervention and the standard therapy divided by the difference in costs. And the second one is the ICFER, which is the incremental carbon footprint effectiveness ratio, which is the difference in carbon divided by the difference in health effect or health benefit. And so Kindred suggests that you report 2 or 3 of these ratios. And my thought is, is that how would that then be used in decision making? But it is an interesting principle. The other way, so they're in parallel, if you like, not in the ISA. The other way is to bring carbon into the ISA in an integrated evaluation, and that could either be done by monetizing the carbon dioxide equivalents into dollars and including those dollars in the costs of both intervention A and B, or converting the carbon dioxide into health impacts and including that on the effect side. The costing, the monetization is usually done through a social cost of carbon, and there are many different values that could be used depending on your jurisdiction. All right, I'm just going to skip through some of these slides quickly. So if we were going to include carbon emissions in the cost side of the equation, either in parallel or integrated, then the same principles of identifying your healthcare use, measuring it and valuing it does apply. Within life cycle assessment, which is the gold standard for calculating carbon emissions, you think your cost item, if you like, is called a functional unit, and it would be something like 1 CT scan or 1 hospital birth or 1 skin biopsy. It's one sort of activity. And I liken it to what you might do in a microcosting analysis, perhaps for a trial intervention, rather than what you might do in terms of costing up the follow-up care. So process-based life cycle assessment, you can see here, this is cradle to the grave process. And what's important about that is it includes all of the activities from the extraction of raw materials for a particular product, whether it be a syringe or a catheter or anaesthetic gas, right to the end of the product's life. So it includes storage, waste disposal, etc. And waste is often one aspect of climate impact or environmental impacts that is very tangible, people think a lot about. So process-based life cycle assessment takes all of these processes into account when you are calculating the carbon footprint of a given product. These are the publicly available carbon emission data sets. So you don't need to do a life cycle assessment for every single product. There are many, many products and components of products that are freely and publicly available. And environmental economists encourage people to deposit into these repositories any new work that they have done. So you can see those there. SimmerPro is the software that I've had a little bit of a play around with, and this gives you a snapshot here. There's a nice little free tutorial you can do if you're interested in SimmerPro, and it's comparing the carbon footprint of home coffee machines. So it gives you a little bit of an idea and a tutorial running through the components of those products. I talked about then the valuation, so how you value, once you've got your kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions for each product or each service, you then value them, and the social cost of carbon is probably the most straightforward way to do that. Each jurisdiction has a different value, and recent commentary suggests that they're all probably too low in that they discount what the impact of rising global temperatures is on future generations. Anyway, again, that's another theoretical debate for another time. New South Wales Treasury, which is a an input value we've used has a high, medium and a low value for a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, and the mid value is $130. The highest I could see is the German Environmental Protection Agency, which is up to €800 per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. I won't have time to go through the worked example, so I'm going to skip that bit, but I'm happy to give you the reference for it and just bring up a couple of discussion points. So the first one is probably, if you go to, this extent of work, and you then have some information about kilograms of carbon emissions for a particular product. What do you do then in your deliberation to inform decision making? And I think some of the harder questions are things like, should we be paying for environmental benefits from our health budget? Should we, in a cost minimisation analysis, where there might be equivalent health benefits and possibly equivalent costs but different carbon emissions, should that then be the decision maker? Do additional ratios help, or are they generally not so helpful? I've got a little bit of information about what the worked example showed, so I won't go into that. Or are there other methods that might be straightforward and helpful in terms of decision making? And I've just put in net benefit there to consider as well, but that would also be using a social cost of carbon. And so where might the inclusion of environmental impacts be most useful? So I'm just going to highlight that we have an international group working on a new CHEERS extension, and this is the CHEERS climate extension, and have mapped different components of the current CHEERS checklist, and then the climate extension and different items that are required. And we're about to undertake a Delphi survey. So invitations to participate in that survey will also come through to ACTA, and you may receive a survey that way. My final message is really, it's very interesting work. It does take a little bit of time, and so probably pick your trial. If you're going to prospectively design a study where you think there might be differences in carbon emissions, and from my sort of fairly limited experience over the last couple of years, what is likely to be high in carbon are interventions that either required a lot of transport in their manufacture, or the implementation requires a lot of transport, where there are gases or anaesthetic gases, and highly manufactured and processed medicines. Okay, so my concluding points, if we are to support government policies to decarbonise healthcare, carbon emissions from new and existing health technologies need to be measured and compared, and following best practice and international standards. You can do this through life cycle assessment, and there's specialised training and software, and you can monetise their new kilos of carbon through social cost of carbon estimates. I think that clinical trials could be helpful because they can provide an opportunity to prospectively identify goods and services and components where there might be high carbon emissions, as well as other environmental impacts, which also can be done through LCA for comparative analysis. And I think there's a really rich future research agenda here. Some references, and thanks for listening, and get in touch if you're interested.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. I completely agree with the last point you made about it being a potentially really valuable future research direction. I feel like it's only going to become more important over time. So thank you for presenting it so clearly. I think it's given us a lot to think about. I'm aware we've reached the end of the hour. So if anyone has any, I'm sure there are lots of questions for Rachel. If anyone has any questions for Rachel, please reach out to her directly and have that conversation, because I think now's the time to be getting in on the conversation as the field is growing.